and immediately picks me up and starts yelling loudly to my sister to call 911. Obviously, my body was in shock. Like I said, I didn't feel pain though, but I knew my body knew that something was wrong. And my dad, he was overlooking, he had the door open and he had his arm up like this, and he was just like crying like this, like yelling. He looked at me, then he would start yelling and crying.
Hello, Janet. Great to see you.
Hey, hi, Linnea.
Hello. We see each other every week on our content calls for Lila together, but this one's a little different. So I want to first off just thank you for agreeing to be Lila's first podcast guest. And Ricky and I knew we wanted to start this at the beginning of the zodiacal year, which is Aries season, which we are now in 2024. And in thinking about talking about the reasons for the season and what we're all going to experience and learn in Aries season, things like courage, learning how to stand up for ourselves, things like what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, dealing with violence, dealing with all those rough and tumble things that happen in life on Earth. I thought of your story because I don't know much about it, but I do know that when you were a little girl, when you were 6 years old in Aries season of 2000, 24 years ago, that you had a very unexpected and terrifying incident happen to you that completely changed the course of your life. And what little I did know about it, I thought, gosh, this is a great Aries season personal story to tell. So what we wanted to do is invite you on, and while you tell us your story about what happened to you, I'll be looking at the progressions and the transits in your chart of what was going on in your life when that happened, and making note of the symbolism that you're going to be speaking as you tell me the story. You'll say something and I'll think of a planet or a sign or a house, and I'll just jot down those notes. And then we'll take those notes at the end of the story and look at the big picture of the themes and the life lessons of your life and what was happening to you in that very pivotal moment. Because we would like to show people that you can go back in time and look at someone's chart and understand things that have happened in the life by studying what activations were occurring in that natal chart at that time. And yours is a most unusual and intense and gripping story. So what better one to kick all of this off with than yours, Janet? So thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Linnea and Ricky, for giving me an opportunity to talk about my story. It's always very emotional to talk about it just because it really hits home. And it's something that I still, and everyone and anyone who's watching and listening will understand, but every day I'm reminded of my story. And being able to have you reflect back what was going on in the sky during that time, I feel like it's going to really help me remember how, that this wasn't happening to me, but it was happening for me. And I think, you translating and communicating, this was happening, and I'm like, oh, okay, maybe this is why this happened. And I will be able to, even though I already do accept and have so much compassion for myself in regards to what has happened, it's a good reminder that, the stars are here to guide us. And it's something to just, welcome with a lot of grace and acceptance, versus just, taking these experiences that happen to us and looking at it as like, why, and have a very negative hat around it. So, yeah, I'd love to go ahead and tap into my story.
Yeah. So tell me what kind of life you were born into, as a baby, as a child, as a little girl, leading up to that moment when you were 6. What was your family life like?
I grew up in a very loving home. My parents back then were very religious, so we were definitely churchgoers. We were in a we were in an organized religion. So often, you will see me go to church multiple times a week with my family, go to school, come home, do Bible study and homework. But we were in this religion obviously because my parents wanted us to, and it was all out of love, and it was great. Honestly, like I had great friends at church. I was considered to be the wild child, always, staying super active, climbing on trees. We lived out in a small city of North Carolina called Asheboro, and we were out in the country where we lived, and there was woods in front of my house, and I would always, I remember vividly after school always running into the woods. I was a pretty active child. I was always just, like I said, outside going to church or doing homework. And I loved it. Obviously, I was just a kid with no worries in the world, loving life and just doing my thing, being taken care of by the most amazing parents. And everything changed, in April of 2000. That took me from being a child to having to grow up and be an adult due to the traumatic experience that I went through.
So this is a great place to pause and take a look at your natal chart and see where all of these themes that you just told us about, let's see where they turn up. Let's see where they are, because we're not just saying, oh, are they going to be in there? We would expect them to be in there, as above, so below. So we're going to take a closer look. Now, as you can see, this is Janet's chart. The inner wheel is her birth chart, and the outer wheel are the progressions that were happening on the day of the accident. We're going to first look at the slower moving progressions and what they were activating, and then we're going to move on to look at transits the day of the accident when we get to that. But first, we're going to just start looking at her natal chart to say who's here and what specifically is going on with this person's body. So we're going to look over to her first house. Her first house, the reason why we're going to focus on that first is because in astrology, the first house rules the human body and everything that happens to it. So if something happens to your body, your first house has been activated. And when we say activated, we mean either a placement inside that house or the planetary ruler of the cusp of the first house has been activated. So in Janet's case, we look at this person and we see there's an upside down looking horseshoe in her first house in the sign of Gemini. That's the only placement inside the house itself. You see that she's a Taurus rising, which means that the planet Venus also rules her first house. But we're really interested in what's inside the house first. So looking at the South Node, let's take a minute here. For those of you who are new to evolutionary astrology, the principal concept of it, or a fundamental belief in it, is a belief in multiple lives and in reincarnation, and that this is not our first rodeo. And we want to ask, well, what has my soul experienced up until this point in my journey? Who am I coming into this life as a Scorpio sun? And all the other things that Janet has in her chart. The answer to that in evolutionary astrology is we look to where the South Node of the moon was at the time of Janet's birth. And we see that she was born in that generation for 18 months, where the South Node was in Gemini. Now, we're not going to get into any of the details of that. We can do a whole other show about this. But the reason why we're talking about it now strictly is because it's in her first house. Otherwise, we would not be talking about this, because the conversation today is about a issue that happened to Janet's body at a very specific point in time. So when we look at this South Node here, we see, okay, this is an indicator of Janet's karmic past. So this means that there's this theme here that's gaining momentum. The idea of I've been there, I've done this over and over again. So when it's in the first house of the body, we realize there's something karmic going on with this person's body. So realize that's not the case for everybody. But if your South Node is in the first house, that's the first thing we sort of sit and ponder. What is the karmic thing going on with this person's body and how they present themselves to the world? Now, South Node in the sign of Gemini. What does that mean? Well, it can mean a number of things, but typically we would first think that this indicates we're dealing with a karmic story of a young person. Gemini is symbolic of youth and being young. So we get that. That's step one. Step two is, are there any hard aspects to that placement in Janet's chart at 3 degrees Gemini? So we look around and we say, yeah, there sure is. The first hard aspect to that South Node is Mars opposing the South Node from the 7th house. It's at the very, very end of Scorpio. Yeah, that Mars is at the very end of Scorpio. And as we can see, it's going to, throughout her life, inch its way up into Sagittarius. But it is within the orb of the South Node that we would say that opposition from Mars is affecting her South Node. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, I'll give you a little tidbit from Yesterday's Sky by Stephen Forrest. Here's what he says about Mars opposing the South Node. Or with an opposition, it may be something that created an overwhelming obstacle for you in a past life, what we would call the brick wall of reality. Now, that's the oppositional position. With Mars there, what does Mars signify? Violence in a nutshell, to be killed, hurt, or maimed, or even to be manipulated by the threat of those things, leaving a deep gash in the soul. Okay, so that's some heavy stuff, but there you go. So now we're going to say, is there anything else creating a hard aspect to that South Node? Hard aspects we say are either the opposition we just looked at or squares. And we see, yes, there's also a square to that South Node coming from her moon in the 5th house. What is the symbolism of the moon? Again, taking an excerpt from Yesterday's Sky, personalizing the moon, we might imagine family, or specifically a mother having a challenging impact on you in a prior life. Perhaps you were utterly defined by your expected role within the clan. Typically, there's a vulnerability to being defined again by the needs of others with whom there are clan ties. Okay. Wow. So there's that piece coming in and saying, hey, I'm a part of this story. So that's your South Node story. There's a lot more there, but we don't have time to go into it more than that. We just say what's creating hardness or friction that when activations come later and those get activated, what types of stories and themes do we see coming up? And most importantly, we would ask, when would we expect this karmic wave of the South Node and movements to it and angles to it? When would we expect that karmic wave to break in the life of Janet? Well, we would expect to see something happening when that Mars that I pointed out natally, that through major progressions, it moves to the point of within 1 degree of opposing that South Node. So when it gets to 2, 3, 4 degrees Sagittarius, now Janet's first house is activated through that karmic portal, and her body is now open to those karmic events occurring. So that's just looking at this chart, we would say, oh, there's something in store for this person coming up. That Mars is close, and in not too much time, it's going to hit the point and manifest something in her life. So I think we've covered the specific part of Janet's chart we want to look at from a natal chart perspective. We don't need to get into anything else right now. There's a lot going on in everybody's chart, but we're staying on point with Aries season and what happens to the body with accidents and so forth. So what we're going to do now is go back to Janet and have her now tell us what happened on the day of the accident. And when she gets to the end of that, we'll jump back into her chart again. So Janet, why don't you tell us what was going on in that Aries season 24 years ago?
So it was in April of 2000. I came home, riding the school bus. I came home. I ran inside, dropped my backpack, and my sister was like in the kitchen, and I ran quickly by her, went outside to the backyard. And at that time, we had a really huge backyard, like almost like an acre. And I had a habit of always riding the lawnmower with my father. It was a 4-wheeler. And he would just, I would be sitting on his lap and he would be driving it around and I'll be there, smiling really big and just happy because I'm riding along with my father. And that was the thing that my dad and I always did together. It was a bonding experience between a father and a daughter. But this time around, I decided to climb on the back of the lawnmower without him knowing. He didn't even know that I had come home from school. There was a moment that he had like stopped and there was a step attached so I could just like jump on. And essentially I did that once he stopped and he started driving around. And, anytime that I write about this experience, I always write down that I was like this little girl with a big smile on her face. I still vividly remember the wind blowing through my hair because I had a short haircut, because I was just riding along and, the wind was blowing and I was happy. I could see my Dalmatian dog not far away and the weather was great. It was spring. And so I was, really happy, having a great time. And then my father decided to stop the lawnmower. And that's when I decided to put my left leg down and the lawnmower knocked me over and started going over my leg. And I started yelling and crying. And with my right leg, I was hitting the backseat of my dad's lawnmower. And that's when he realized that I was underneath. And he jumped off. And I remember him grabbing the lawnmower and just essentially with all of the adrenaline that he had, essentially just threw this heavy, heavy lawnmower off of me, almost like really far away. And immediately picks me up and starts yelling loudly to my sister to call 911. I don't remember any pain. All I remember was just a lot of heatness towards my lower body, a lot of hotness. And I also remember glancing down, seeing my Dalmatian dog running up with us up the hill because the backyard was kind of like a hill. The Dalmatian dog was running up with us. And I just remember my dad crying so much as he was carrying me up, and he put me in the back seat of our red Nissan Altima vehicle that I still remember very vividly. And yeah, I was just yelling and crying and just like losing my mind because obviously my body was in shock. Like I said, I didn't feel pain though, but I knew my body knew that something was wrong. And my dad, he was overlooking, he had the door open and he had his arm up like this. And he was just like crying like this, like yelling. He looked at me, then he would start yelling and crying. And what felt like a matter of seconds, it was maybe like 10 minutes, an ambulance arrived. And at that same moment, my mom also arrived from her work. And I was in the back, of course, of the ambulance. And my mom was like, crying on top of me, and I was crying as well. And we were on our way to the hospital. And it was the moment when they started disinfecting my leg is when I actually felt pain. And it was the alcohol that they were using. And that is the worst pain that I have ever felt to this date in my life. Because,
Really?
yeah, like I still remember that pain. It felt like so many needles just like, shocking my body all at the same time. That was the pain that I remember. I don't remember the pain when the lawnmower was cutting my leg. And a part of me feels like the reason why is because my body had so much adrenaline that it numbed the pain when it was cutting, when the blades were cutting my toes, half of my foot, half of my calf muscle. So yeah, I was in the backseat of the ambulance and there was multiple people in there. And yeah, I just remember two of them were holding me down because I was just like, kicking them and hitting them and crying. And my mom was like holding my head down. And then they started giving me injections on my fingers and I just kept pulling away. And then I started getting really sleepy. And it turned out, I later learned that the reason why I was getting really sleepy is because the injections, they were giving me, pain medication. And my mother was just, I eventually calmed down and I wasn't crying, and my mother was just rubbing my head and she was still crying though. And I started closing my eyes, but she kept telling me not to close my eyes because she thought I was going to pass away. And but I closed my eyes and I fell asleep. And then I just remember when I opened them, they open. It was right when the ambulance doors opened and we were behind the hospital and they were taking me in. And ironically, there was a mother and a daughter up there, like up, towards the entrance, who were there, who were just there to visit a family member. And they were actually people from our church.
Oh,
And just like ironically, out of, and I saw them, and I remember, raising my finger and saying hi to them. And they're just like, is
really?
Janet? Yeah. I just remember I was just like laying there and I saw them and I just rose my finger and just like said hi to them like this. And that's how the church found out that I was in the hospital, because there was church members there already.
This episode is so good. We wanted to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you for tuning into today's podcast on YouTube. If you are absolutely enjoying this episode, make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Did you hear? We just released new Aries mugs. Check out our brand new shop page on lilaverse.app. Links available down below. Let's get back into the episode.
A nurse came up that I still, like I said earlier, I've written my story multiple times, and this is how I normally describe her. She was this like older, heavier set woman, very short blonde hair. You could just tell like she has been working for many hours and for many years, because she had a lot of wrinkles. And I noticed like she had like a big mole on her on her face. And she came up to me with so much with a huge smile on her face and was like, hey, like something terrible did not just happen. But
Yeah.
she was trying to keep me, in a state of calmness and peace. And she held my hand, and we rolled into surgery, and she whipped out a balloon that had a face on it that was not inflated yet. Hey, I want you to blow into this balloon while we give you your injections. So she was making me inhale a lot, and then hold my breath every time they gave me an injection. And then I would blow into the balloon, and it wouldn't make the injections hurt. Then also they were making me blow into the balloon because it was a gas mask essentially that was going to put me to sleep for surgery. And so she held my hand as I kept doing that over and over again, to the point where I fell asleep. And then I woke up, I don't know how many hours later, in the hospital room with my family at the end of my bed. It was my dad, a doctor, and my mom was on the chair. And I looked to my right, and the hallway was filled with so many church members and a lot of my family members. And being a Hispanic family, like you already know, we are a very big family. So the hallway was really full, and we already had so many people there. So essentially what I learned later in life, what was happening on that day when I was going into surgery, is that the doctors came up to my parents and said she needs a blood transfusion. She's lost a lot of blood, mine, remember, like I was 6 years old. So obviously I'm still developing. I'm a child. I had lost a lot of blood, but unfortunately at that time, my family was part of this organized religion. And in this organized religion, they have a guideline. They have this belief that blood transfusions are not actually good for you. So, if you think about it, like it was a very hard decision, but due to the religion, my parents said no. So they were running the risk of me passing away, and which is why I ended up getting multiple surgeries over time, because my healing took longer because I didn't receive blood transfusions. But yeah, I woke up, and it was like, quote unquote, like a miracle in the eyes of my family and church members, because I didn't, and even nurses and doctors, because I didn't get a blood transfusion.
When your parents said no to the blood transfusion, that's probably rare for the hospital to have to address that. I mean, that probably doesn't happen very often. And it's with respect to a child who's not allowed to decide herself. You may be too young to remember, but I am so curious to know how the doctors and nurses responded to that, because from where they're coming from, that could have been seen as such neglect to take care of something so obvious to people who don't carry a belief in sharing blood and so forth, or see it differently. And even I could see some being like, we need to report these parents, because this child's going to die on our watch because we're not allowed to help her. Like, do you remember anything about that, or hearing the stories later? And, even just the drama of like all the other churchgoers standing there witnessing. I mean, what a stressful moment for your parents, because it's a moment of extreme faith that they had to apply with everybody watching and see how is this going to turn out. But talk about a lot of different emotions around, like, I'm not even sure how I feel about, I mean, you survived it, but at the time, I'm sure many people thought they were going to watch a child die in front of them unnecessarily in their mind. That's really intense.
It's very intense. So, when I look back, and to answer your question before I dive deep, I dive into some more details of what my parents may be feeling at that time. So I later learned in life that social services did go to the hospital because it was an accident between a parent and a child. I don't know what the conversations were about the blood transfusion, but I know social services were involved because of it. And they had to interview my parents, they had to interview my sister to make sure that I wasn't in an abusive household, which absolutely wasn't. And in regards to, how my parents, how they may have felt at the time, it's like, I know different people today may be like, oh my God, I would hate my parents. Like, screw them. Like, like people have such like a negative, like they're just going to dismiss their parents, for making this decision like that. But I made a point earlier to say that they were in an organized religion. And I personally consider that religion is a cult. So they're very extreme, and they do bring, like, they have the tendency of like, this is our beliefs, this is our guidelines, our structure, our rules. And as you may know, a lot of religions nowadays, like, they will brainwash you, and they'll make you believe like you're doing this out of love. You're doing this because you love God. If you're a true lover of God, this is how you have to live. So my parents, they were going based off of what they thought was the right thing to do. At that time as a kid, I didn't understand what was happening. Later on in life, when I started digesting my experience and started, working more with plant medicine and started exploring different belief systems and everything, I came to the realization that my parents obviously weren't doing it because they were just, trying to follow the rules. They thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were doing that out of love. And thankfully, it just, it worked out because I did survive. And, if I didn't survive, who knows if they would still be part of that organization. But I'm kind of grateful that they were still at that time, because we ended up getting a lot of support after my accident from the church and from my family members. So it's kind of like bittersweet, but it's an interesting thing to think about, because them feeling like this obligation to God, but also obligation as a parent to, and not knowing, and then this pressure, seeing family members and churchgoers there in the hallway, witnessing this entire process, like, my poor parents.
Okay, so this is a great place to pause and jump to your chart and look at what was going on and what was being activated in your chart in April of 2000. Okay. So we don't know the exact day, but we do know within about a 10-day range, which is fine. I chose to look at, because when you're looking at people's progressions and transits, you have to pick an exact moment in time, actually even to the minute. We don't get too worried about that with things like this, but I had to sort of pick a day between April 10th and 20th. And I ended up choosing April 14th because there were also a lot of quick moving transits getting activated that day. So to me, it looked like a very active day. But first, let's go back to what we were saying in the last segment about Janet's South Node in the first. And when is that karmic wave going to break? And so we look at the day of Janet's accident, and we now see from the outer wheel of that progressions chart, her Mars, we call it the progressed Mars, has 6.5 years later from her birth, moved up to the point of 4 degrees Sagittarius. So 5 degrees away from where it was when she was born. Now, the significance of that is that her nodes are at 3. And when we look at these progressions, we say activations occur in the one orb leading up, and then it hits perfect, and then also in the waning orb leaving. So this Mars, as we can see, had been activated for a while, probably a couple of years, when it clicked into 2 degrees. and was approaching that 3-degree perfect point. So she's in the waning part of it. However, as that was happening, and this is where we see the Marsiness of the incident, right? But now we say, okay, well, that's not enough necessarily. Where do we look to say, okay, what part of her body was affected? And can we see that in the chart? Yes, we can. The second part of this that we're looking at that is a double activation is her progressed sun. When Janet was born, her Scorpio sun was at 16 degrees. She was born kind of smack dab in the middle of Scorpio season. You can see from progressions, everything, the sun moves a degree a year. So when we're looking at this progressed chart and we see that the sun is at 23 degrees, we can do the math and say, oh, that was 7 degrees from her natal position. She must have been 6 or 7 years old. You can tell that just from doing the math, looking at the chart. But the significance of that is we see that sun at 20 is now at 23 Scorpio, and it is making an exact square to her 11th house Saturn in Aquarius, which is at 23 degrees Aquarius. Okay. Now, why that's interesting is because from a medical astrology perspective, we always look to see what's going on with Saturn in people's charts. Many astrologers call it the seat of illness or a vulnerable place in our bodies. So we say, what sign or body zone is that Saturn in for Janet? Aquarius rules the lower leg below the knee. So just keep that in mind here. Capricorn rules the knee. Aquarius rules everything below it, including the ankle, and then Pisces rules the foot. So we see right there a hard aspect hitting a vulnerable part of Janet's chart. And Ricky and I practice studying astrodynes, which means we also look at harmony and discord in people's charts, which a lot of astrologers don't do. And because that Saturn natally is being hit by so many hard aspects, that Saturn and Janet's 11th house and the sign of Aquarius is a discordant zone of Janet's chart. Janet has a very harmonious chart. In fact, nearly every other placement, every other sign, every other house is harmonious. This is the only area of Janet's chart that shows noticeable discord. And I bring that up because the whole reason we're doing this is to learn about what happened that day and realize that in the life of a person, these cycles are always happening. And at different times, these different parts of our chart get activated. And so we can learn from these patterns and say, when is the next time that that area of Janet's chart is going to get activated? Only this time, she's going to know about it ahead of time. That's the whole reason why we're looking at this. So we see here that this progressed sun is hitting the Saturn and is hitting the body part, the area where Janet experienced her accident. As she explained to us in this prior segment, her left leg, her calf muscle was affected, and all that area around the ankle and the part of her foot. So we would expect something would potentially happen with that, given this square here. Why this progressed sun is important is one of the ways we talk about it as a symbol to understand it in evolutionary astrology is that it's the representation of the evolving self. And at this point in Janet's life, that sun is now in Sagittarius. So we see here that this progressed sun is hitting the Saturn and is hitting the body part, the area where Janet experienced her accident. As she explained to us in this prior segment, her left leg, her calf muscle was affected, and all that area around the ankle and the part of her foot. So we would expect something would potentially happen with that, given this square here. Why this progressed sun is important is one of the ways we talk about it as a symbol to understand it in evolutionary astrology is that it's the representation of the evolving self. And at this point in Janet's life, that sun is now in Sagittarius. And getting overtones of adventure and travel and so forth. But at this time, it was still in Scorpio. And when we think about Scorpio and we see in Janet's natal chart, she was born with several Scorpio placements. And when we think of Scorpio, we think of things that are buried, that it's their time to come to the surface. Okay. Difficult things that scare us. And with Janet here, with the sun getting activated, the part of her story that made me think about her son was when she talked about how many people so quickly were there around her, praying their hearts out at the hospital. And when you see an image of a person and all these people gathered around it, the person that people are gathered around is the sun person. Everybody was revolving around Janet. That's a sun moment to realize, wow, all these people are here for me and I'm just at the center of this, right? So that's an important part of this story in coming out, and that identity being activated and activating that Saturn part of her chart, that difficult part of her chart. And we see from her story that was a very difficult story that she just told. So now let's look at her transits, because what we would expect to see now is that the slower moving progressions we just looked at are now going to get a layer of activation on them. So imagine sort of like a brewing volcano, and the progressions in anyone's chart, such as this one that we're looking at, the lava is hot and getting warm and starting to bubble, and it's coming up, but nothing has happened yet outside of the volcano. It hasn't fully erupted. But those are the progressions. That huge foundational energy has to be there in order for the spouting of anything to come out at the top. So what we look to now is say, what transits were going on at the same time on that same day? Transits, a lot of them are faster moving for the faster moving planets, such as the moon. It moves really quickly around the chart, as we all know. And Mercury, Venus, and Mars move relatively quickly. So does the sun. It moves through a sign in 30 days. And then we have slower moving transits too. Jupiter sometimes is considered a faster or a slower. It's kind of in between. But then the slower ones we have are Saturn and the rest of the outer planets. But when looking at her chart now, we're going to, again, go back to what was going on in the first house. What was going on with the so-called malefic planets that show up when we see illness or accident or whatnot. So we go to our first house and then we say, oh, do we see any transits involving Mars or Saturn? Yeah, we do. There they are, right there in her first house. This was where Mars and Saturn were. They were in the sign of Taurus for everybody in April of 2000. So these are planets that are actually moving through the sky at the time. And as we can see, they're both at 16 degrees Taurus, directly opposing that sun that we just talked about from its natal position in Scorpio. That's a hard aspect. That's adding on top of everything that we just talked about with that Mars and with the Saturn getting activated through progression. Now, I chose this day only because we've seen that Mars doing its thing. And then I kind of thought, well, what's going on with the moon? Because as we heard from Janet's story, she used so many great Mars words and Aries words. She tells us about how her dad's lawnmower went over her left leg. And then she tells us this, I just get such a visual, the adrenaline, as she said, of dad being able to throw that heavy piece of machinery off of her. That's a Mars thing. When you see men lifting up cars to save somebody under a car or something like that, or what she described her dad doing, that's Mars. The superhuman strength to be able to do something because the adrenaline is probably at the highest it ever was in his life. And you can see the remarkable strength of what Mars is capable of in those moments of, you imagine what soldiers were capable of on a battlefield when they were feeling that kind of adrenaline running towards people and being scared out of their minds. So we see here the same planets lining up, but from the transit perspective. And of course, the natal planets being activated in the sign of Scorpio, right? Like, even though her parents refused the blood transfusion, she survived anyway, right? People forget, like, oh, that's a Scorpio kid. The survival instincts, the survival, Scorpio is a very strong sign because of its rulers of Mars and Pluto. And in your chart, there's a fair amount of harmony around them, right? You survived this, and you lived to tell a great tale about it, and you evolved rapidly through this event. A lot of people go through Mars events like this and they die. They don't make it. Game over, and they have to begin again. But in your chart, there is a fair amount of harmony. And so even though this is a quite intense story, there's a lot of happiness around it, or a lot of, it's okay. Like, I went through it and I changed as a person, and I would never want to be anybody other than the person I am today. Right. So, the reason why I chose this April 14th day was to see it happened in your home. So I thought, okay, might we see some sort of activation to that moon that's already picked up in your nodal story? So I chose April 14th, as you can see from these transits, because on April 14th of 2000, the transiting moon was moving through your fifth house, and it was lining up with that moon, which would just give it a little boost. We don't give a lot of attention to transiting moon, but in events like this, where you're trying to rectify a chart or make your best guess of when it happened, you look for every little quick moving thing. And everything else here is moving, but not moving in that the day before or after they would probably still be at the same degree, but that moon moves quickly. And so even if we looked at the next day, that moon would have moved off that moon and would be going up your chart. So I don't know, maybe someday we'll go back and find the hospital records and find out the exact day, and we'll see.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've addressed that a lot was going on in her first house, and we see that it's hitting all that stuff in Scorpio. Is that Saturn that we saw getting hit by her progressed moon by square? Is that Saturn also getting hit double time by transit? Well, let's take a look. We see conjunct that Saturn at 20 degrees, the planet Uranus. We sometimes call it the god of earthquakes and lightning bolts. It's unexpected. It brings the unexpected, and it often shows up in accidents, because so many accidents, we don't expect them to happen. And it's life-changing. And we see that it's on your natal Saturn. Now, 3-degree orb, yeah, but we see that it when we look at it and we go back, it goes back and forth, and I check the dates. And that was very active during that time. It had already gone over your Saturn. It had retrograded back to 20. And so it was going to go back over another time. So that Saturn, we would say, has already been activated by the Uranus, because it got ahead of that 23 degrees earlier in the year. So your Saturn was already primed for Uranian energy leading up to this. But then we see, that stuff in the first house going on, that Mars and that Saturn is tough stuff. And were this part of a computer program, these kind of moments would be pulled out and alerted as nothing to get scared about, because we're not doing anything. We're not going into superstition here. But what we're trying to show is that each chart has its unique moments in time, where we would call them perfect storm events, and they're different for everybody, unless you plug this information into a computer that can now do this for us, because it takes a long time for humans to sort this out. That we would have said, wow, there's going to be a period in her life where a lot of these boxes are getting checked. And once you start seeing another planet, another, we would say, okay, when is that time when the quick ones are lighting the fuse and then the volcano erupts. This is what we hope to, and we know that we're going to do with Lila, is that we're going to be able to tell people about those exact windows of time so everybody can take care of everybody and be just a little more aware of what energy is swirling through the air and how to use it constructively. So that was definitely a Mars time for you and your father. And without this sort of information, you would have no way of knowing that that was going to sweep through your life. And with that curious Gemini South node hopping on the back of the lawnmower playfully, that energy would use that moment and say, here it is. That's where where all this is gonna come through, right? But yeah, imagine a world where we're able to say to people ahead of time, particularly with children who love adventure and love play, to say you're going to let them be them, but in these windows, maybe that's when we go to the library, and that when we do the other things, and we make choices based on the weather, right? And that's what we're hoping to do here. And what I would love to do with your chart in the future is that we'll do a follow-up piece to this and look at other times in your life where these activations, where a lot of boxes were checked, and see when it's coming up in the future, because it is fun to look at all this and find exactly what we expected based on the energy you described in your chart, and the energy you described is here. The Mars representing the surgeries and the blood, the blood and all of that. You can see these things turning up in your story. But okay, so what? So we've rehashed the past. Well, that's why I want to understand the details, line them up, and say when a chart shows this happens in a life. This is a potential. And then we start saying, okay, as a woman, as she gets older, you're not likely to encounter a lawnmower again, right? But it's going to be something else. It's going to be something that an adult in the life that you're living will come to you through your life, and to say, let's show her when those times are, because those can be major, with all of this Scorpio in your chart, major transformational moments, just with less collateral damage and setbacks to it.
A part of me feels like obviously it would have been great to have known what was happening in the astrological weather before the accident happened, but also I wouldn't be where I am today if none of that had happened. Mm-hmm. And it's good to look back at experiences and compare them to what was happening in the sky, because it just reminds us, when you have a better understanding of the experience from a higher view, it kind of welcomes more a little bit of self-compassion and just a sense of, okay, so what's next? How can I now look at my chart and what's to come and navigate that according to what I've learned already about my past? So it brings like a sense of relief, but also I do feel like, once we learn a little bit more about where to look on our chart to be ready, just like we do with, like you mentioned, like the Weather Channel. We look at the weather and we decide what our activity is going to be for the day. We can do the same thing with astrology. But it's also a reminder again that even though these things happen to us and we're just now looking back at them, it doesn't mean that they weren't meant to happen, but there are some teachings in it, and now we can utilize that knowledge as power to help navigate our destiny and create that destiny, based off of this new information that we have. Yeah,
absolutely. And what I love doing this deep dive in your chart is realizing and hearing your story is, when you see people who have a lot of Scorpio in their chart, like you do. My mom has a lot of Scorpio like that, all lined up just in the 4th house of her chart. But what we see is when there's a family member that has a lot of Scorpio like that, we often see they're involved in situations that, relative to the family and to the people in your life, you are the agent that is designated to bring difficult material to conscious thought and to conscious conversation. And having the bravery to do that, to say, I'm going to be that one that's going to bring up that thing that I know is going to make people uncomfortable, but must be brought up in order for people to move past their wounds and their stuff. And we could do a whole other segment on how you represented that for your family and for the church, even that Uranus Neptune conjunction in your chart that your generation has, that is very strong in yours. It's sextile your natal sun, and how you look at the religion you're in and say, wait a minute, ask that Uranus question. Is this religion, is it really aligned with me and who I am? And a religion that doesn't talk about a lot of things that are healing to talk about, especially for a Scorpio. So I can just almost see, like, as a storybook, like how your story is this little girl that required people to be confronted with certain things that they wouldn't have been confronted with had that accident not happened. So it did change you, but listening to the story, it had such a ripple effect on so many people, so many people, that it's just like, wow, when you think about the Lila of the connections that we have to each other, and how it's not just our growth, but that we've agreed to play supporting character roles in other people's journeys, and that you show them certain things they wouldn't have seen. And sometimes when there's a group that says, no, I'm not going to look at that, I'm not going to look at that, I'm not going to look at that, we're going to put our heads in the sand, it requires a dramatic event to get everyone to pull their heads out and to look at something that's uncomfortable. And that was you. And just realizing, and yet there was a harmony to it all. I mean, obviously not what happened to your body, but there was a harmony. Like, you speak so lovingly of your parents, and I'm sure they do of you, and all of that. So I just can feel like a bigger story when I hear all this. It's like, it's a really beautiful story where I'm like, oh, I could write a little children's book about this. But recognizing, like, you're playing that role for the rest of your life. And ideally, the things that will happen to you in life that I witness, or anyone in your life witnesses that are scorpionic, hopefully they're more advantageous to you than destructive, or just the things that happen when we're just not aware of our environment or whatever. It's not even a judgment. It's just, oh, her awareness expands. She can now manipulate the energy instead of just sort of be thrown around in the wind by it. And it's, with you, it's in a very, very intense energy. So the more you're aware of it, and you're able to harness it and release it when you want and use it when you want, you become a very powerful person. Like a Scorpio who knows how to harness that energy, and most of them don't. It's like, damn, like, look out. So, and that incident showed you how much power of intense energies running through you and running through that family.
Yeah, I want to point something. First of all, thank you for all of that praise. That was awesome. I absolutely love hearing, how you could even write a little children's book. Thanks for the idea. But I wanted to point out, because you said, this experience, it made people look and face certain things. And it reminds me of the pandemic, where it's, we've been so caught up with our day to day that we actually realized what was really going on in our bodies, in our mind, and in our environment, because we were forced to quarantine and we weren't distracted anymore by our everydays. And so people who, have amputees, have, physical obvious scars and defects, they're walking reminders that sometimes we need to face the dark truths that is very uncomfortable to face, but they're there. Step back, everything is lovely and dandy sometimes, but from a Scorpio perspective, that's what we do. And also, and for those who, have those physical limitations, like we're just a walking reminder of like, hey, there are uncomfortable truths. There are things that are going to make you feel like they're going to make, there are things that you have to dig up that needs to come to the surface sometimes in order to welcome growth. Growth happens when you've surrendered to the uncomfortable parts of yourself and life experiences. So yeah, that's what came up for me as you were speaking on that. And it's, when trauma another thing I want to mention is like, this is another reminder that we don't have to wait until something terrible happens to us in order for us to grow, in order for us to get, have these lessons fall in our laps. This is a reminder that there's people like me who show up and share to tell you, like, don't, you can already have this, you can already have this knowledge, you can already have this, experience life at its fullest without having to be run over by a lawnmower. So a reminder, don't wait until something happens. Just go ahead and just start, embrace your experience, embrace all the things that are happening, and allow them to be tools in your toolbox and serve as wings on your back to thrive and to take on whatever comes before you.
I just see so many potentials with this, I just got this idea listening to you that I thought, oh, like we can create an algorithm where we can tell the community of people that use Lila when they're going to line up and have similar activations stacked like yours, where it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's just how is it going to express. Energy can't be created or destroyed, but we can with consciousness manipulate it if we know it's happening and we work with it as it's happening. So I just got this idea where, like, listening to you, I thought, wow, people leading up to those sort of progressions and transits that are going to cause a major event to happen, one way or the other, that we will know when those are coming up for people, and to think like you'd be a great coach to have like Zoom sessions with leading up of like, shit, Janet, like mine's coming up next year and you got to walk me through this. Let's talk about the potentials, right? Like, I can't imagine like what happened to you happened to me, but what are other things? How can I orient, and learn from, and you have that because you've been through it and we've identified it and we identify the energies. So then we see, it's like these support groups. Everybody goes through these, but you can't tell just by looking at people who or when or whatever. You have to look at the charts and you have to run the data for the computer to tell you these are the same windows of this energy. And I just think a beautiful thing for society is that we start identifying people who then are the perfect person to talk to. Not just like somebody else's coach or somebody else's therapist or whatever, but a person who's actually been through it. That's who I want to talk to.
That's a really good idea. Absolutely.
So think about that's what we would, that's where we're headed with this, because the point of this is not to be like, oh, wow, astrology, look, it seems to work, right? The whole point of this is to track the data, see when it's happening to other people, and to help each other. And to help each other. Forewarned is forearmed. So helping each other know, and that just breeds compassion, because when you're talking to that person, wow, they're about to go into that energy field. It's an energy field that's activated that has a very specific feel to it. And we can find the people who've been through it and who have a very evolved attitude about it, and those are really the life coaches. And the life coaches for a very specific thing, right? So for you, for me, I had a Mars event like yours. I'm looking at this Mars transit that we just talked about, and I was having a direct hit Mars transit when I unexpectedly had to have a semi-emergency C-section. It was the biggest surgery I'd ever had. I don't really spend much time in hospitals or anything like that, but it was the same energy. And I was terrified. I was so scared to give birth. There were underlying progressions, and then the Mars transit hit. And then I had a C-section with a lot of blood and staying in the hospital and all the things that also applied to yours, just very different circumstances. But this is what I'm talking about, is getting people prepped, mentally ready. Because if you're mentally ready going in, there's such a power in that. It's like studying for a test, even if it's the AP class, and it's like, I still know I'm gonna ace this because I've thought about it, I've prepped. It's sort of like how the ancients prayed to the gods. If you acknowledge they're there, they'll dance with you nicer than if you ignore them, just like humans. So that's where I'm really excited about exploring this work. And I love that you were one of the first people that we've done this deep dive in, because this is, we're just getting started with this. I fully expect you're going to be a reoccurring guest on the podcast as we go deeper into what we've already started uncovering with your symbolism. And as we start looking at later points in your life, and maybe we even bring on interviews with other people who had incidents similar to yours, and you can interview them, and we can show the similarities in these events that are happening to people, so that we can create not just, support groups for amputees or support groups for cancer survivors, but go the next level of like, and realizing that these points in time happen at prescribed times.
I definitely am open to these new ideas, but more importantly, all of this, the podcast is meant to just put more in the spotlight how much more we need to pay attention to what's happening in the sky. So this is, given an opportunity to really talk about a very emotional part of my life, and then hearing you speak on what was happening in the sky. It's just a reminder that we sincerely do have the power to create our destiny and to co-create with the stars. And so I'm excited to see what more episodes we can create, so that way people can continue to learn through this experience with us as we grow, and start trusting Lila a little bit more over time, and also use it more on a daily basis versus just it being another astrology app, because we're going beyond the surface. We're taking really deep dives beyond that, from medical astrology and more. So that's very exciting. I'm really excited to be a part of this journey, and I'm looking forward to the next ones.
Thank you for telling your story so openly and vulnerably and detailed. And we've worked together now for a few years, but now I just feel like I just like know you in a different way.
Yeah. This is
in a way that I'm like,
Thank you.
It's really wonderful to be working with someone, and that's a whole other thing. Of part of this was in my own self-interest working with you, that I knew me doing this with you would give me insights to you where you become like a more dimensional being to me than just Janet, right? Like that I'm like, I can see where she's come in, and which I can see now sort of your bigger mission, and I can feel what superpowers are in you, having gone through this, and how you are now and how you communicate about it is really, really powerful.
Thank you so much. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
I just have all these ideas now that we'll explore separate from all this.
Yeah.
And I love
use
that
it as an excuse. To use it as an excuse. Yeah, I understand.
So,
but you gave me a lot of ideas when you were saying that, because I was like, shit, that's really true. Because I do a lot of motivational, spiritual content. The coach that I identify as a spiritual business coaching, because that's what business and marketing is what I know. But when you started talking about, how coaching can be utilized in Lila, I started getting some ideas. I'm like, well, I could go on and 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 talk about reshaping past experiences in a motivational way of like helping. Like I started thinking about motivational and life coaching more, and spiritual coaching versus business. So thanks for planting that seed. And it does align with the shamanic side of my archetype too. Because I remember when I did the reading with Ricky, he did the same exact thing that you told me, is like, you're here to make people face get uncomfortable and face those uncomfortable truths. And I feel like that is something I am good at with some of like, just in general with my content and conversations. And I've done podcasts like this a couple of times when we talk about my experience. So it comes out so natural, so I know that it's going to, like, I'm starting leaning towards more that and kind of weaving out the business side, based off of what you just said. So thank you for that idea.
Because you have that like beautiful Venusian to Taurus rising. Like you're just like pretty to talk to and look at, and but you're honest. You're not fake. And you will say things very directly. So there's this beautiful balance there that I'm imagining, like if I went through some sort of experience, and I haven't had many body issues. So the idea of going through something that you described to me, I had to like sit with, and I'm like, that would be fucking awful. Like, I can't have that happen in my, what would it be like if I was bedridden? What if, and I just thought, gosh, if something like that ever happened to me or someone I knew, now that I've studied your chart and now that we've talked about this, and I see that concentration of scorpionic psychotherapist energy in your 7th house of clients and people you work with, I'm like, whew, like if that happened to me, I wouldn't go ask for, oh, somebody tell me the best person. I would call you and like book time with you and say, emotionally walk me through this. And so it wouldn't even have to be the exact kind of accident. That's the point, is people have ended up in situations, unexpected, terrible, whatever it is, where they end up in that convalescent state. And you have emotionally been there. You've been there in the you've gone through the felt experience of very, very specific things that people do go through all the time in the world, and what it's like to recover, and then what it's like to have to go back into a community and how people treat you different. Those are broader themes that not just an amputee, a piece of the body in an accident. There's themes there that I'm like, she's been there and I haven't. Like, she's been in that year of recovery where you're young and like your childhood's cut off. Well, that happens. That does happen to people. That does happen to children. And I'm like, God, like if we were able to organize things such that we knew people's charts, or even we were able to put you with children, especially, it's really powerful, because you don't even realize how much of a like non-chip on your shoulder you have about it. Maybe you do, probably not, because we can never, unless it's like someone else, but you really are like, you're an ideal like face and one-on-one person with that. And I just see that for you, that's coming for you, is you're going to be known in that way. And it doesn't even mean you go into the details of the accident. It just means people know they can come to you and tap into the energy of somebody who's been through that. Mm-hmm. And that's really powerful. Like even your sound bowl thing you were talking about, I can even imagine you, like, I haven't been to one of these in a while, but I'm imagining like in your class, and like you have a microphone, and sometimes you kind of give little pieces of advice, to people, like, ever been in a situation, ever had that feeling where life came at you and just put you on your back for a year at a time, like you don't even have to say, you know what I mean? Like just that. Yeah. And people can feel she's not just like a singer singing lyrics that didn't happen to her.
It's almost poetic.
That's why Taylor Swift's popular, because she even said she wouldn't be famous if she wasn't singing her own lyrics. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Linnea. I really appreciate all of this. This was very, very rich and very nurturing, and just it was very helpful for me personally, not just having just doing a podcast. So thank you for creating space, for allowing me to learn more about myself, and just reflecting back a lot of things that have come up for me too.
My pleasure. Well, we love you. Ricky and I love you. You're part of the family. And we can't wait to keep continuing this conversation with you.
Hey, Ricky Williams here, co-founder of Lila. Thanks for watching and listening to our first episode on the brand new Lila Podcast. If you loved today's episode, please click like and share this episode with a loved one. Today's guest was Jaimes, a multi-passionate entrepreneur and artist. She runs her own conscious marketing business, helping brands like us at Lila elevate their online presence. Janet moonlights as a sound healer called Sofa Paloma, Janet's alter artist ego. As a certified spiritual coach and sound healer with mindfulness and somatic therapy training, Sofia Paloma is dedicated to holistic wellness and personal transformation. To connect with her, you can find her website and links down below. Thanks again for tuning in today. We'd love for you to hit subscribe so you don't miss our next episode.